Hi! If you're new here, all you need to know is that I have watched the first season of the One Piece live-action adaptation, and now, for the first time ever, I am reading the manga, and, more specifically, the chapters that the live-action has covered so far. Today is the last video in this specific series before a break, because I'll be covering the final chapters that made it into the live-action, from 91 to 95. I know there are some things from future chapters that were adapted too, but those chapters also contain new material and I want to go into season 2 as blindly as possible. The only thing I took from the future chapters are the cover stories so that I could finish the story about Helmeppo and Koby, and I'll discuss it in this review as well. With all of that said, let's begin. I loved the fight between Luffy and Arlong. Sure, I liked that fight in the live action too, and on the surface level, it wasn't too different from the manga, but there are a few key differences that made this fight in the manga, at least to me, seem so much better. First thing I want to highlight is the comedy even during the most serious moments, and that applies to the manga as a whole. Like in chapter 91, I found it hilarious when Luffy stole Arlong's teeth. It felt like such a Luffy move, and it's really hard to explain what I mean by that exactly. I already spoke about it in many of my earlier reviews, but Luffy has a very specific brand of comedy, and also a very specific type of creativity when he fights. I feel like with most of the other characters, their jokes and the dialogue in general usually doesn't surprise me. But with Luffy, it's literally impossible to tell what he'll do or say next, except maybe a few running jokes like loving food, for example. As a reader, I love it, but I feel like in universe, this aspect of Luffy should be so terrifying for his enemies, especially when, so far, none of them took Luffy seriously until it was too late. The next thing I want to highlight is that it was very cool how we actually got to see Arlong fight in the water. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that in the live action, the only times we saw Arlong touch water was when he splashed Luffy with it, and also when he and the other fishmen swam to Baratia. Given how much they talked about fishmen being unbeatable in water, now that I think about it, it was odd that we didn't see live-action Arlong trying to bring the fight into water. I understand that filming underwater is much more challenging than filming on the ground, but if I ignore any technicalities and medium limitations, then the manga made way more sense with how we saw multiple fights underwater, or at least partially underwater. The next thing I want to talk about is Arlong's line in chapter 92. He said in reference to Luffy, "I'll skewer his worthless heart." It might be just a translation thing, and I don't know what was the original Japanese meaning, but I still want to discuss this specific phrasing. On the surface, calling Luffy's heart worthless is just another example of Arlong seeing humans as inferior, but I think there's also another level. There's so much irony in calling Luffy's heart worthless, when Luffy has the biggest heart in this story. Even more than that, he is the heart of the story. It's Arlong himself whose heart is worthless. Even if it's just a translation thing, I still think that's a great and fitting phrasing. Another interesting thing is that chapter 92 had a callback to chapter 1. When Arlong got mad and his eyes changed, it was stated how that's how the eyes of the Sea Kings look when they go berserk, and we were shown a small flashback panel from Chapter 1 to the sea monster that ate Shanks's arm. I might be forgetting things, but I don't remember hearing the term Sea Kings before, so I'm assuming that's the general name for those massive sea monsters. I also think that the reason why this detail was included specifically now is because the Straw Hats are going to the Grand Line very soon, so it's probably a setup because the Grand Line should be teeming with monsters like that. But let's go back to the chapter. The fight setting switches to Nami's room, and this portion of the fight is the main reason why I loved it in the manga way more than I did in the live action. The first thing that got me was Luffy picking up a pen and observing how this pen has blood on it. It was one panel, 6 words, and yet it broke my heart. This is a perfect example of the principle less is more. In the live action, the main symbol of Nami's suffering in that room was a literal shackle around her ankle with a chain. When I watched the show, it totally worked for me, don't get me wrong, but there's also no subtlety in that detail. That symbol of suffering was very in your face. However, a pen with blood on it says so much more through so much less. This symbol of suffering is much more subtle compared to a shackle and a chain, and because of that, it also hits emotionally so much harder. Since I watched the show first, I didn't think too much about that detail, but if I had read the manga first, I would have been so disappointed that this little detail got removed. To be fair, the live action did show how Nami drew maps until her fingers bled, but it's specifically the fact that Luffy found that pen, observed that detail, and connected the dots that touched my heart the most. Another thing that, in my personal opinion, was very important is the destruction of the room, and more specifically, the different context for destroying that room. In the live action, Luffy targeted the room because it was the key to Arlong's dream, and in One Piece universe, destruction of a dream equals beating your opponent. It made perfect sense. In the manga, everything that I said still applies, and it's great, but there's an additional level. It felt like in that moment, beating Arlong was Luffy's secondary goal. His main goal was simply destroying the room because it was a physical reminder of Nami's suffering. It was a physical manifestation of Arlong's idea of what a crewmate is, and by destroying that room, Luffy showed what being real crewmates should look like. He makes sure that people who follow Luffy follow him because they want to, because it's their choice, while Arlong created a cage for Nami through that room and hid it under the label of crewmates. The difference in presentation in both versions is very small, but the way how I interpret things, I saw that difference, and to me, personally, it feels very significant. Now let's go from serious stuff to something sillier. First, I loved how Luffy broke Arlong's nose. It was very satisfying, and that's all I have to say about that. Next, I adored the detail that Zoro slept through most of the fight. It seems that Zoro taking naps and missing what happens is another running joke. He slept through Gaimon's Island, he slept through Nami's backstory, he slept through the fight against Arlong, and that's just the things I can list at the top of my head. Maybe sleep is the real secret to his superhuman strength. And once I started thinking about it, I remembered that the live action also made a joke about Zoro's beauty sleep at some point, so I guess now I know it was a nod to his tendencies in the manga. The next silly thing is that I chuckled at how Nojiko ignored Sanji and hugged Genzo instead. Sanji is hopeless, and I love it. Before reading the manga, I was a bit scared that I might not like that version of Sanji. He is obviously supposed to fill a certain trope in the manga, and I usually hate that trope, but so far, Sanji is written to be more adorable than actually pervy and off-putting in any way. But going back to the chapter, the silliness continues when Nezumi shows up and gets shut down immediately. Zoro tells him to stop being a wet blanket and Nami kicks his ass. Also, the small panel where Nami returned the hat to Luffy was very sweet. It was a silent thank you and an acknowledgement of what he did for her and her village. There was a bunch of other sweet interactions. Basically, entire chapter 94 felt very sweet and lighthearted, like all Aftermath chapters after each arc were so far. One thing I want to highlight is when our crew talks about needing a doctor on the ship. I think it was around 6 months ago when Netflix released a character introduction video for Chopper, and he was introduced as a doctor. So I'm like 99% sure that Chopper will join the Straw Hats in Season 2 as a doctor. Also, that video was probably the most adorable thing I saw on my screen in 2025. I already love that character, and technically I haven't even officially met him yet. On a semi-side note, I have more thoughts about potential new members for our crew, but I'll probably make a separate video for that. Chapter 95, the last chapter I read, was an emotional one. First, we saw how Genzo continued acting like a father figure to Nami as he threatened Luffy to treat Nami right. That's another example of how the live action sometimes suffers because all these small details and side character stories have to get cut. Another thing that stood out to me from an emotional standpoint is the real meaning behind the tattoo. In the live action, Nojiko just had those tattoos for the sake of keeping the original character design, but in the manga, the whole reason why she had those tattoos in the first place was to make Nami feel better. And as if that wasn't already enough for my poor heart, by the end of the chapter, we're also told that the tattoo design is literally a combination of a tangerine and a pinwheel. In other words, a mother figure and a father figure. It's criminal that the live action removed that. I understand that Genzo in the live action was a background character and it wouldn't have hit as much, but still. On a more fun note, I loved the fact that Nami left the money she collected to the village only to rob the villagers as the Straw Hats were departing. When I saw her running to the ship, I sort of suspected that this might be the case, but still, that was insane behavior, and I absolutely loved it. It's nice that Nami, as a character, didn't change just because she doesn't need to pretend anymore. She's still a thief, even if now she doesn't exactly have a specific goal she's working towards. I'm curious how the live action will handle that in the future, because the show made it seem like Nami was only stealing because she needed to. After the departure, we got a very short flashback to explain why Genzo started wearing a pinwheel on his head. It was to make Nami laugh instead of scaring her. But now Nami isn't a kid anymore. Now she left home as an adult to chase her dream, so now that pinwheel isn't needed anymore. So Genzo left it by Belmir's grave. My heart literally barely survived this chapter. I feel like Oda always does this thing structurally. He writes something light and fun to make readers let down their guard. Then he starts hitting us right in the feels. Then he creates an illusion that the emotional part is over before delivering the final emotional punch. Honestly, at this point I can't decide which departure was my favorite, Usopp's, Sanji's, or Nami's, because they were all just so great. The final plotline I want to discuss is the Koby Helmeppo cover story. This one was really good. I loved the Buggy Crew stuff too, but since I have a much bigger attachment to Koby as a character, I loved this cover story even more. We saw how Captain Morgan escaped and took his own son as a hostage. I kind of forgot just how horrible Morgan was, but this part was a pretty effective reminder. The Marines wanted to shoot them down despite Helmeppo's presence on the boat, and my favorite boy, Koby, protected him even when he was shaking and sweating like crazy. I compared Koby and Usopp many times in my reviews, how they do what's right even when their knees are visibly shaking, and I love both of them for that. I am also quite intrigued by Garp's assistant. The live action mentioned his name at some point, but I don't remember what it was. In the live action, from what I remember, he just mostly stood to the side looking all cool, but this cover story showed that he's a very skilled swordsman. I wonder if we'll ever see him and Zoro face off. We also saw Garp himself smash the cannon like it was a cardboard box. The live action also showed that he's insanely strong physically, and in general, Garp is a very intriguing character to me. He just looks like someone who has a juicy backstory, and I can't wait to learn about it. And now, let's talk about what I think is the main difference in the live action's portrayal of Helmeppo. In the show, we also saw him slowly warm up to Koby, and by the end of the season, he stood up for what's right. But the manga showed Helmeppo's direct independence from Morgan, and I feel like that's very important. When Helmeppo was introduced, he reminded me a little of Draco from Harry Potter, with the whole "wait until my father hears about this." It's clear that Morgan played a massive role in shaping Helmeppo, so to me it was very important to see how he directly stood up to his father. Helmeppo chose to be independent and swam back to the Marines instead of going with his father. Sure, Morgan might be horrible, but he's also what's familiar to Helmeppo. The Marines, on the other hand, is a new development. It's a scary change, and yet Helmeppo chose that change. It's a shame the live action didn't have this direct confrontation. Next, I want to mention a small funny detail, how Morgan only took Garp out because Garp, apparently, had been sleeping. I can definitely see the family resemblance. Both him and Luffy are ridiculous. I also found the structure of this cover story very interesting. Because we only get one page in a chapter, it makes sense for these stories to be quick-paced. Buggy's story was exactly that. I think each page delivered a lot all at once. But this cover story about Koby and Helmeppo really slowed down in the middle. 3 whole pages were spent on nothing but waiting for Garp's judgment. I think it was done intentionally to build the suspense and to make Garp seem as extremely important, even when he hasn't been introduced in the main manga pages yet, and I only know how important he is from the live action. Next, I want to mention one clear similarity to the live action. We see how in both versions, following your own moral compass is a huge plus in Garp's book. In both versions, he started training Koby and Helmeppo because they stood up for what they believed was right, even if they broke the rules for that, and that was probably the most important point to deliver at this point in this storyline. My final observation about this cover story is that in the last few pages, there was a lot of bird imagery. It could mean nothing, and Oda simply drew those birds because they're cute, but it also could be some sort of a hint. Maybe it's something power-related, like the ability to fly, or maybe it's more symbolic, like a symbol of freedom. At this point, I have nothing concrete, but it was still interesting how Koby and Helmeppo were constantly surrounded by birds as they trained. The way how this whole plotline was adapted into the live action is very interesting. The marine plotline was a huge part in the show, and by the way, it was a part that I enjoyed a lot and was invested in it. But now, after reading the manga, where this story just didn't exist, I have some questions about how it will be handled in Season 2, but I think that's another topic I want to leave for a separate video. And that is where I take a break in the One Piece manga. Before I end this, I know last time I promised to mention my criticisms about the manga. I'm actually shocked how much I loved it. I already loved the show, and I still do, but somehow, almost impossibly, the manga feels so much better. The thing is that the only things I didn't like in the manga are literally nothing more than nitpicks that apply to the whole genre and not just One Piece specifically. The first thing is that it was noticeable how characters always wait for someone else's fight to finish before starting their own, when, realistically speaking, those fights should be happening simultaneously. It was especially noticeable in Arlong Park. Only Usopp's fight fit in nicely because it was in a separate location, but with Luffy, Zoro, Sanji and their opponents, they all always waited for one fight to be done before jumping into action themselves. I understand that in the manga medium it's difficult to do it differently. You either have to explain the timeline or keep breaking the pacing of the fights. But things like this still kept taking me out of the immersion. Another thing that was very noticeable and kept taking me out of the immersion was the constant commentary about the fights from the side characters. I know this is very common in shonen manga and anime, but it's also painfully noticeable, and personally, I dislike this tendency a lot. There were also a few individual plot lines and characters I simply wasn't invested in, but I already mentioned them all in my earlier reviews. Other than that, I absolutely loved everything else. Like I said, it's almost funny to call these things criticisms when they're literally just tiny nitpicks. This was an insanely good introduction to the characters and the story. People keep saying how it only gets better, and it's hard to imagine how there can still be room for better. But that's all I have to say about the manga for now. So, what's next for me and this channel? First, I want to rewatch the first season of the show to refresh my memory and also to try and look for the many small references to the manga I know the show made. Once I'm done, I want to make a video about my final general thoughts. For example, comparing the characterizations of the Straw Hats in the show compared to the manga, talking about my expectations and theories for the future, maybe even a list of my favorite moments in both versions respectively, and so on. I am also open to suggestions on what else I could talk about. And finally, once the second season of the show comes out, I will do reviews for each episode separately. Other than One Piece, I am slowly working on other things too. I am currently watching Stranger Things and I know I will definitely have some opinions once it finishes, and whether those opinions will be good or bad remains to be seen. I am also watching Percy Jackson TV show. I'm a book lover, so I feel like reviewing episodes separately is a bit pointless, but I will do a whole season review once it's done. I will also finish talking about MHA and the second season of MHA Vigilantes once that comes out. Other than that, I am mostly improvising with this channel, but I hope I will manage to create something that will interest you even before we get back to talking about One Piece. Thank you for listening to this video, and thank you for following this whole series I'm doing. I am insanely grateful for every comment, every like, and every subscription, and I hope that slowly but surely I can grow this channel into a little nice community of nerds. So, hopefully, I will see you later.